Some people come into your life in a strangely smooth way. No conflict, no invasion, no clear signs of danger. They arrive with enough kindness to let you let your guard down, but not kindness too much. They arrive with interest, but not exaggerated interest. They ask simple questions, light comments, small gestures that seem absolutely normal. And that's exactly why almost no one realizes what's really happening. Because before a manipulator gets really close, he observes, he measures, he tests. It is not a declared test. There is never a time when someone says, "I'm going to evaluate your limits now." The process is silent, almost invisible. Small behaviors, seemingly innocent interactions, details so subtle that they go unnoticed even by very attentive people. But for those who know how to look, the pattern appears. And when you see this pattern, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. Many people. They don't come into your life by chance. They get in because you passed a test. Think of something simple. Someone makes a slightly disrespectful comment, and then laughs like it was just a joke. You notice the discomfort for a second, but decides to ignore. You don't want to seem exaggerated. You don't want to create a bad atmosphere, so you let it go. On the other side, someone watches. Not your external reaction, but your tolerance. Because social manipulators rarely invade emotional territory without first check if there is resistance there. They prefer something much more efficient. Small psychological experiments. Silent experiments. A subtle interruption. A criticism disguised as humor. A demand too small to seem like abuse. And then they watch. Do you react? Do you question? Or do you explain too much? Trying to maintain harmony. Now let me ask you a question that may be uncomfortable. How many times in your life have you felt like someone crossed a small limit? And did you still choose to ignore it? Maybe you thought it wasn't worth arguing. Maybe you said to yourself that person didn't mean it. Perhaps he rationalized, reinterpreted, softened the moment. Most people do this. In fact, empathetic people do this all the time. And here's the unsettling part. Manipulators know this. They don't need direct attacks. They don't need explicit aggression. What do they look for are much more valuable signals. Signs of tolerance. Signs of adaptation. Signs that, faced with a small discomfort, you prefer to adjust yourself in instead of confronting the other. That's when the test starts to pay off. Because for a social predator, what matters is not who you say you are. What matters is how you react when something isn't right. An experienced manipulator doesn't ask if you have limits. He provokes. It creates micro-situations where these limits need to appear, and when they don't appear firmly, the information is recorded, silently, almost like someone analyzing a door to find out if it is locked. You might even think that that little episode meant nothing. But for some people, it meant everything. Because in that moment, without realizing it, you answered a question that was never done out loud. How far can I go with you? And sometimes, the answer comes too quickly. Worse. Sometimes it comes before you even realize you were being tested. What makes this process even more disturbing is that these tests almost never, they look like tests. They hide within common behaviors, trivial conversations, social situations apparently innocent, little moments that no one imagines being watched so closely. But someone is. Social manipulators, especially experienced ones, pay attention to things that most people ignore it completely. They don't just listen to what you say. They watch how you react when something goes wrong. Because it is, at that moment, in the micro-discomfort, that your emotional structure appears. For example, imagine that someone arrives a few minutes late and acts as if this is completely normal. No apology, no explanation. Just continue the conversation as if nothing had happened. It may seem like a small detail, but for those who are testing, this detail is precious. Do you mention the delay? Do you express discomfort? Or do you smile and continue the conversation, trying to keep the atmosphere pleasant? This type of situation reveals much more about a person than long conversations about values, character, or respect. Because declared values are easy, real limits appear in small frictions. Now look at another example. Someone makes a slightly inconvenient request, nothing extreme, something that requires a little effort on your part, but which clearly could have been avoided. Maybe ask a favor in a bad time for you. Maybe interrupt something important you are doing. Maybe demand your attention when you are clearly tired. And then, silence. They watch. Do you say no, or do you rearrange everything to suit? This is not about the favor. It's about your reaction to social pressure. Because manipulators don't look for weak people. This is a simplistic myth. They are looking for something much more specific. They look for people who are predictably conciliatory, people who avoid conflict, people who explain too much, people who feel uncomfortable appearing tough, people who carry an exaggerated emotional responsibility for the well-being of others. Now stop for a second. Breathe. And think honestly. When was the last time you said no firmly, without explaining too much, without say sorry, without trying to make it up to the other person? This question usually generates silence, because most people don't realize how much they try to soften their own boundaries. And it is exactly at this point that the tests start to work. A manipulator does not need to press hard at the beginning. On the contrary, pressure, excessive fear scares and drives away. What he does is much more calculated. It starts with something minimal. An interruption here, a small request there, a slightly uncomfortable joke. Nothing serious enough to warrant a strong reaction, but enough to reveal something essential: how you react to social discomfort. If you ignore it, it registers. If you laugh to avoid awkward weather, it registers. If you explain yourself too much, it registers. Every small interaction becomes a piece of information. It's almost like putting together a map, an emotional map. And the more you try to maintain harmony at any cost, the clearer this map becomes. Here there is a psychological detail that few people understand. Manipulative people are not looking for moments of weakness. They are looking for patterns. An isolated error doesn't mean much. But when someone repeatedly demonstrates that they prefer to absorb discomfort rather than generating discomfort, this reveals something extremely useful for those who want emotional control. Because those who avoid conflict at any cost generally also avoid confrontation injustices. Those who fear appearing rude often tolerate disrespect. And those who feel a constant need to be understood tend to explain too much, justify too much, give in too much. To a manipulator, these are not moral failings. These are structural opportunities, small openings in an emotional architecture. And when these openings appear often enough, the conclusion begins to dawn, form, silently. No confrontations, no ads, without you noticing. Because at that point, the person on the other end is no longer trying to figure out who you are. She's already discovering how far she can go. There is a specific moment when these tests become even more difficult to understand. It is not when the person shows hostility. It's not when it crosses an obvious limit. That's when everything seems too normal. Light conversations, occasional laughter, small gestures of closeness that seem natural in any human relationship. Nothing that raises an immediate alert. But beneath this normality, there is something happening. And here's a twist in perspective that tends to bother people when they realize for the first time. Many of the interactions that seem spontaneous are sometimes probes. Not necessarily consciously planned in all cases, but still functioning as extremely efficient social tests. For example, someone shares a little personal story, something slightly embarrassing, or an intimate detail of one's own life. It seems like a gesture of trust, but watch what happens right after. They pay attention to how you react. Do you open up too? Do you give something personal in return? Do you try to show that you are equally vulnerable? This type of movement creates something social psychologists call reciprocity, emotional. When someone exposes themselves, we feel a silent pressure to do the right thing. Same. And in healthy relationships, this can build real closeness. But in manipulative contexts, it can function as information gathering. Because the more you reveal too soon, the more material someone has to understand your fears, your insecurities, your emotional needs. Now think about another type of situation. The person makes a joke, nothing extremely offensive, but a joke that touches lightly on something sensitive about you. Maybe your way of acting, maybe something about your personality, maybe even a disguised comment about your insecurities. Then she laughs. And watch. Do you laugh together? Do you try to show that you didn't care? Or do you defend yourself? Because there is a curious phenomenon in human behavior. When someone laughs at something that bothered us, we often laugh together so as not to air too sensitive. You've already done it. Almost everyone has done it. Laughing at something that actually hurt a little. And at that moment, something very specific happens. Silent information is transmitted. The information that emotional territory can be touched without major consequences. Now imagine small variations of this happening over days, weeks, maybe months. A joke here, an ambiguous comment there, a small invasion of emotional space. Nothing big enough to warrant confrontation, but big enough to test tolerance. There is a disturbing detail in this process. Many manipulators don't even need to lie. They just create situations where you spontaneously reveal how you react to pressure social. And it's at this point that a lot of people start to notice something strange. Maybe you've already felt this, a slight feeling of discomfort that is difficult to explain. Nothing clearly wrong, but something in the air seems off, as if little things don't quite add up. Maybe a person sometimes goes beyond limits and then acts charmingly. Maybe she makes strange comments and then says it was just a joke. Perhaps she alternates moments of closeness with small gestures that generate doubt. And here's the problem. When these signs are too small, our mind tries to normalize. We rationalize. We tell ourselves we are reading too much into it, that maybe it's just the person's way, that it's not worth creating tension. Now I want you to notice something important. Pay attention to your own experiences. Have you ever had the feeling that someone always seemed to test the waters before moving forward? A little more. First, a little provocation, then a little more intimacy, then a more invasive request, as if each step depended on the previous reaction. This is no coincidence. This type of progression is extremely common in manipulative dynamics. Because manipulators rarely take big risks early on. They prefer something much safer. They advance only to the point where they meet no resistance. And when they don't find it, they go a little further. Slowly, almost imperceptible. Until one day you realize that certain things started to happen in the relationship that, in the end, beginning, you would never have accepted it. And then a difficult question arises. When exactly was that line crossed? The answer is often uncomfortable. She was not crossed at once. She was pierced, millimeters at a time, and every millimeter was allowed for something that seemed too small to deserve attention. But for those watching on the other side, every little reaction of yours was saying something much more revealing than words. I was saying where your limits end, and where does it begin? The space that someone can occupy within your life. Now comes the hardest part to face. Because when we start to understand how these tests work, it's tempting to say, all responsibility on the handler. And yes, there is intention, calculation, and coldness in many of these behaviors. But there is a silent factor that makes it all possible. Something inside us. Something deeply human. Most people do not fail these tests out of intellectual naivety. It's not a lack of intelligence. It's not a lack of basic perception. In fact, it often happens exactly to sensitive, reflective, and emotionally aware. The problem is another. It's the almost automatic impulse to maintain harmony. You probably know this impulse, that moment when something bothers you, but another inner voice says, maybe I be exaggerating, or it's not worth creating a climate, or even, better let this pass. That voice sounds mature. It seems reasonable. She even seems empathetic, but in certain contexts, it can become an open door. Because social manipulators rely on a very common characteristic in people. Empathetic. The tendency to give the benefit of the doubt, always once again, and one more, and one more. Now think about something curious. When someone shows kindness occasionally, our brain tends to use these positive moments as justification for ignoring negative signs. It's a well-known psychological bias. Small good gestures gain enormous emotional weight, while small discomforts are minimized. You may have already experienced this. The person does something that makes you uncomfortable, but then she is kind. Then she gives a compliment. Then she demonstrates closeness. And then your mind starts to rearrange the narrative. Maybe I misinterpreted it. Maybe that joke wasn't so bad after all. Maybe I'm too sensitive. This internal process is powerful because it creates something that manipulators understand all too well: emotional confusion enough to prevent clashes. And here there is an important contrast that few people notice. Empathetic people often feel emotional responsibility for others. Manipulators exploit exactly this. When a small friction arises, the empathetic person tries to resolve it, explain it, smooth it out. She seeks understanding. She seeks balance. She seeks peace. But for someone who is testing limits, this reaction does not mean peace. It means access. Because when you constantly try to preserve the other person's comfort, you begin to silently negotiate your own comfort. Now imagine this process happening over and over again. A little discomfort today, another one tomorrow, another one the following week. Each alone seems too small to justify a strong reaction, but together, they create something deeper. They train you. They train you to tolerate a little more. They train you to explain a little more. They train you to adapt a little more. And when this pattern is established, the manipulator no longer needs to test as much, because the dynamics are already clear. There is another emotional trap in this process: the need to appear fair. Many people have a strong sense of emotional justice. They want to be balanced, reasonable, understanding. This is admirable. But manipulators know how to use exactly that against you. Because when you want to be fair, you start to consider all the explanations possible for the other's behavior. Maybe he's going through something difficult. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe you didn't notice. Maybe it wasn't intentional. And while you're analyzing all these possibilities, something important happens. The limit that should be simple becomes confusing. Now let me ask you another question. A question that perhaps you have never stopped to formulate clearly. How many times have you justified someone's strange behavior, even before this person explained? This happens very often. We fill in the blanks to maintain each other's positive image. But manipulators don't need to destroy this image. They just need to keep it ambiguous. Good enough for you to keep trying to understand. Strange enough to allow them to go a little further. And so the tests continue. Not because you are weak, but because you are human. Because you try to understand before judging. Because you try to preserve relationships. Because you try to believe that people act with good intentions. And paradoxically, these are exactly the qualities that make certain people so interesting for manipulators. Not because of fragility, but because of emotional predictability. Because when someone knows that you will always try to understand before confronting, it's much easier to test your limits without major risks. There is a point in this dynamic where things stop seeming just strange and begins to reveal a method. So far, we've talked about tests, small provocations, micro-limit invasions. But if you look closely enough, something more structured appears. Manipulators do not test randomly. They test in layers. First comes the emotional reaction tests. Little comments, little criticisms, little ambiguous jokes. The goal here is not to hurt you deeply. It's measuring something much more specific. How much discomfort can you tolerate before reacting? If you react quickly, clearly, the manipulator realizes that that territory is not easy. But if you soften, explain, laugh, ignore, he receives silent information. There is space here. Then comes a second layer. Availability tests. Here, small requests, small demands, small intrusions of time or attention. Nothing big enough to look like abuse. Something like a late-night message expecting an immediate response. A last-minute favor requested. an expectation of constant presence. Again, the goal is not the request itself. It's observing how much of your life you reorganize to accommodate others. And there is an important psychological detail here. When someone responds to a small request, the brain tends to justify its own attitude, saying, "I did it because I wanted to." This phenomenon is known in social psychology as behavioral rationalization, and manipulators know how to use this, because every little yes increases the likelihood of another yes in the future. Now the third layer appears: guilt tests. This is one of the most revealing moments. The manipulator creates situations where you may feel even slightly responsible for his emotional well-being. Perhaps a subtle comment, "I thought you were different," or something even lighter, "It's okay, I just thought you could help." Do you understand how these phrases work? They don't accuse directly, but they create an emotional field where refusing starts to seem selfish. And when someone shows a tendency to assume and this emotional guilt, the manipulator records, because now he knows there is another type of access available. Access through emotional responsibility. Now pay attention to something that usually surprises a lot of people. Research in behavioral psychology shows that small initial concessions drastically increase the chance of larger concessions later. This effect appears in classic studies of social influence. First a small request, then a bigger order, and then another. Each step seems reasonable when compared to the previous one. But if you just looked at the beginning and the end, you would notice the jump. This is exactly how many manipulative dynamics develop. Not through great impositions, but through invisible progressions. First, you accept a little uncomfortable joke. Then tolerate a more personal comment. Then reorganize a plan to help. Then accept unfair criticism. And when you realize, you are already wasting emotional energy trying to maintain the balance of your life. Relationship. Now comes the coldest part of this logic. For an experienced manipulator, each of these situations functions as an experiment. He presents a stimulus and observes the response. If the response shows resistance, he backs down or changes strategy. If the response shows adaptation, he moves forward. There is no drama. There is not necessarily anger. There is observation. There is calculation. There is strategic curiosity. Almost like someone pressing lightly on a wall to find out if it is solid or hollow. And when the wall gives way, the test ends, because at that moment the person already knows something essential. She knows the door isn't locked, and from then on, the approach stops being an attempt. It becomes an access. There is a silent moment when the handler stops testing, not because he lost interest, but because you already found the answer you needed. The little emotional experiments worked. Reactions were observed. The limits, or lack thereof, became clear enough. And then something changes. Subtly, the approach accelerates. Maybe you've already experienced something like this. At first, the person just seemed curious. Light conversations, occasional comments, little moments of closeness that seemed to come naturally. But suddenly, the intensity increases. More messages, more expectations, more presence, sometimes even a strange feeling of connecting too quickly, as if that person suddenly decided that you had a special proximity. This phenomenon is common in manipulative dynamics, because after the initial tests indicate low resistance, the manipulator switches to another phase, the emotional occupation phase. It starts to take up space in your routine, in your time, in your thoughts. Not necessarily aggressively. In fact, it often happens through something that seems positive. Attention, interest, validation. Maybe the person will start praising you more. Maybe it says that you are different from other people. Perhaps it demonstrates a deep understanding of your personality, and for a moment, that may seem comforting, especially if you're someone who values genuine connections. But there is one detail that many people realize too late. This accelerated closeness creates emotional dependence faster than real trust should allow. And when addiction starts to emerge, so do strange behaviors. start to increase. First small ones, then a little more obvious. Maybe subtle criticisms. Maybe sudden changes in mood. Maybe moments when you feel guilty about something you don't even fully understand. And here appears a phrase that usually marks the beginning of a more manipulative dynamic. Clear. You are exaggerating. Or something like that. You got it wrong. That's not what I meant. These phrases do not seem aggressive, but they have a powerful psychological effect. They shift the focus. Instead of discussing the person's behavior, you start to question your own perception. Did I misinterpret? Am I too sensitive? This process even has a name in modern psychology: relational reality distortion. It doesn't have to be extreme for it to work. It just needs to happen frequently enough to generate doubt. And when someone is already emotionally involved, this doubt becomes even more strong, because now there is something to lose. There is the relationship. There is the bond. There's the emotional investment you've already put in there. And the manipulator knows this. He doesn't need to control everything. It just needs to create enough confusion for you to start adjusting your own behavior. Maybe talk less about what bothers you. Maybe avoid certain topics. Maybe explain more, so as not to seem unfair. Little by little, you begin to walk on shaky emotional ground. And that consumes energy. A lot of energy. Energy that could be being used to live your own life with clarity. Now I want you to notice something important. If you have ever been in a relationship like this, be it friendship, work, a relationship, or even within the family, perhaps you recognize this feeling, the feeling that something has changed, but you don't know exactly when. At first it seemed easy, then it started to demand more emotional effort, more explanation, more careful, more patience. And this happens because the initial test was never the end goal. It was just the entry gate. Once someone discovers that they can take up emotional space without much resistance, the game changes. Because now it's no longer about finding out if the door is open. Now it's about getting in, slowly, silently, until one day you realize that that presence is already deeply installed in your life. And at that point, leaving doesn't seem so simple anymore. But there is a moment when something starts to change inside you. It's not a big confrontation. It's not a dramatic revelation. It's something quieter. A feeling. The feeling that you are expending too much energy to maintain something that should be simple. Maybe you start to notice that certain conversations leave you drained. You may notice that you spend too much time trying to explain your own feelings. Or perhaps an uncomfortable question will appear that didn't exist before. Why am I always the one who needs to adjust? This type of question is dangerous for manipulators, because it breaks the most important spell of all, the spell of constant adaptation. For a long time, the dynamic worked because you tried to understand, soften, accommodate. Did you try to keep the relationship balanced even when something seemed slightly crooked? But when awareness begins to dawn, something inside you slows down. You start observing, and watching changes everything. Because when you start to really observe, certain patterns become difficult to spot. Ignore. That joke that seemed innocent now seems recurring. That comment that seemed isolated now seems part of a pattern. That feeling of guilt that arose for no clear reason. Now it starts to make sense, and this creates an important psychological turn. You stop focusing only on the person's words and start paying attention to the repetitions, in cycles, in small shifts of responsibility. Now let me tell you something that many people take years to realize. Manipulation loses strength when it finds a clear conscience. Not aggressive, not dramatic, just clear. Because manipulators rely on three main things: confusion, guilt, and adaptation automatic. When these three gears start to fail, the entire system loses stability. And sometimes change starts with something extremely simple. A limit said calmly. No long justification. No excessive explanation. Just a short sentence. That doesn't work for me. This type of response may seem small, but it has a powerful effect. because it breaks the adaptation pattern that the manipulator was expecting. Now he has to deal with something different. Clarity. And clarity is difficult to manipulate. But here there is an important point. Recognizing manipulation does not mean becoming cold, suspicious, or paranoid about everyone. The people. That's not the goal. The objective is to recover something that many people have lost without realizing it. Trust in own perception. That little discomfort you felt at the beginning. That subtle feeling of misalignment. Many times. She was trying to tell you something. But we were taught from an early age to doubt these sensations, to be polite, to be understanding, not to seem exaggerated. All of this has value, but it also comes at a cost when we completely ignore our relational intuition. Now imagine something different. Imagine noticing a test. Right at the beginning, a little tease, an ambiguous comment, light social pressure, and instead of automatically adapting, you simply observe. You don't react aggressively, but it doesn't bend either. You just maintain your center, and that completely changes the game. Because manipulators look for predictable movement. They expect adaptation. They await explanations. They expect you to try to restore the comfort of the interaction. But when they find someone who remains stable, something curious happens. Interest wanes, because the test stops generating useful information. And without information, without adaptation, without emotional access, the dynamic loses value for those who were trying to manipulate. This is why true defense is not constant confrontation. It's lucidity. Lucidity about patterns. Lucidity about your own limits. Clarity about the fact that initial discomfort is often an important fact. No, an error of perception. When you regain this lucidity, something changes profoundly. You don't need. You can fight to protect your emotional space. You just make it clear, from the beginning, that it exists. There is a very widespread idea when we talk about manipulators, the idea that they look for weak people. But this image is misleading. In practice, many social predators look for exactly the opposite: sensitive people, responsible, emotionally available. People who care about others, who try to understand before judging, that they have enough empathy to see the side human in any situation. And this creates an uncomfortable paradox. The qualities that make someone a good friend, a good partner, a good colleague. They can also make you an interesting target for those who know how to exploit these qualities. Not because there is weakness, but because there is openness. And manipulators know how to test this opening. They do this in a silent, patient, almost clinical way. First they observe, then they provoke small situations. Then they analyze how you react when something isn't quite right. Do you question? Do you ignore? Or do you try to adjust yourself to maintain harmony? If you've made it this far in this video, maybe a part of you is remembering someone. Maybe a colleague. Maybe an old relationship. Maybe someone from your own family. Someone who, looking more calmly now, always seemed to test the waters before go a little further. If that memory appeared, it's worth paying attention to. Because recognizing these patterns does not serve to fuel paranoia. It serves to develop awareness. Awareness of how certain dynamics begin, almost never with a big mistake, almost never with an obvious attack, but with small, invisible questions that appear within everyday interactions. Questions that no one asks out loud. Are you going to question that? Are you going to let it go? Will you try to understand, even when something seems wrong? Each answer we give to these questions shapes the type of relationship that becomes possible. Now I want to invite you to reflect on something. If you look back on your life, in how many situations did a big problem start with something that seemed too small to deserve attention? A strange comment, an uncomfortable joke, a request that crossed a limit. But that seemed easy to accept at that moment. These little moments are more important than they seem, because that's where the real limits appear. Not in the big speeches about respect, but in the micro moments when something bothers us, and we need to decide whether to ignore or name that. And here is something that few people say clearly. Say no. Saying, this is not okay, or simply not adapt automatically, does not destroy healthy relationships. Healthy relationships survive limits. In fact, they grow stronger with them. Anyone who immediately moves away from a simple limit was rarely interested in mutual respect from the beginning, and that is valuable information, because the goal is not to avoid all the manipulators in the world. That would be impossible. The real goal is something much simpler. Do not offer easy ground for those who depend on silent tests. When your limits appear early, when your perception is respected, when you don't need to overly explain what you feel, tests lose efficiency. They fail to generate useful responses. And when tests stop working, many handlers simply move on. Front. They look for another environment, someone else, another place where the doors seem easier to open. Now I want to hear you. Have you ever noticed someone doing this kind of emotional test before approaching someone? True. Maybe a little tease, a joke, a strange request, something that seemed to measure your reaction. Tell us here in the comments, because when we start talking about these patterns openly, something important happens. People begin to recognize signs that previously went unnoticed, and that creates something rare these days: collective consciousness. If this type of reflection makes sense to you, share this video with someone who also likes to deeply understand human behavior. Sometimes a simple conversation about these topics completely changes the way someone sees certain relationships. And if you made it to the end, perhaps you've already realized something essential. Manipulators don't reveal themselves first. They observe first. They provoke first. They test first. The real question is never, who is manipulative? The real question is different. When someone starts to test your limits, do you notice or do you adapt?